I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker. Frederick Aquino is professor of systematic theology at Perkins School of Theology, Southern Methodist University. Some of his publications include Communities of Informed Judgment with CUA Press in 2004, An Integrative Habit of Mind with Northern University Press in 2012, Receptions of Newman, co-edited with Benjamin J. King with OUP in 2015, the Oxford Handbook of the Epistemology of Theology, co-edited with William J. Abraham in 2017, the Oxford Handbook of John Henry Newman, also co-edited with Ben King in 2018, Perceive Things Divine Towards a Constructive Account of Spiritual Perception, co-edited with Paul Gavrilyuk, no UP, 2022. John Henry Newman and Contemporary Philosophy, co-edited with Joe Milburn with Rutledge in 2025, and John Henry Newman's An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent, a Critical Guide, co-edited with Matthew Levering with Emmaus Academic, also in 2025. He's also published articles and chapters on John Henry Newman, Maximus the Confessor, John Cassian, Deification, Philosophical Receptions of Scripture, and Religious Epistemology. His current project focuses on the relevance of John Henry Newman's thought for issues in contemporary epistemology. The title of his presentation today is Cultivating an Ecumenical Habit of Mind, a Newmanian proposal, and Fred, we're looking forward to it.
When Dr. Christopher Cimarelli invited me to give this talk, I said yes, but then wondered what line of argumentation would I offer today or seek to advance in view of Newman or the declaration of Newman as a doctor of the church. So as I thought back on some of my publications, I don't think I would say I was explicitly engaged in ecumenical dialogue. It just happened that the books I edited were with an Anglican, with an Orthodox Christian, and the joke is pretty funny. Tom Perridge asked me when we were doing the Oxford Handbook, they said, you need to get a Protestant writer or editor, because the assumption was I'm Catholic, I'm Italian. And so today I come to think maybe a little bit more constructively about what it would mean to have an ecumenical habit of mind in light of John Henry Newman. To give some context, I've been a reader and interpreter of Newman's thought, primarily his philosophical thought, for some time. I first encountered his work during my doctoral studies at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. At that time, I had questions about the relationship between faith and reason. So I did a course on faith and reason in the Anglican tradition with Professor William J. Abraham, a Northern Irish Methodist analytic theologian and philosopher. This course focused on the works of Richard Hooker, William Chillingworth, John Locke, and John Henry Newman. I ended up writing a paper on faith and reason in Newman's University sermons. This eventually became my dissertation, which is called Communities of Informed Judgment, which was published by CUA Press in 2004. Thinking about this retrospectively, I don't think when I was in 1996 and 7 that I was thinking of the thoughts that I'm about to reflect on today, that I was thinking about this in any serious way with the future in mind. But I now think back and think about how much I appreciate the backdrop, the ecumenical backdrop of my doctoral work at SMU. I had Ellen Chari on my dissertation committee, William Abraham, as I've also mentioned, and I guess I could say this, Father Charlie Curran. Since then, I've worked with scholars from different perspectives in academic disciplines on Newman's thought, as Chris mentioned. For example, one of my projects was the book Receptions of Newman, published by Oxford and co-edited by my friend, Dr. Ben King. A key aim of this book was to show how scholars across disciplines, for example, historians, theologians, and philosophers, and theological perspectives, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, have all read Newman. Although the book has an ecumenical approach to it, it does not shy away from critical examination of Newman's thought. More importantly, there was no uniform voice among the contributors. That was something that we thought, that's why we called it Receptions of Newman. We wanted to highlight the extent to which Newman was being read by people in various ways, and in some ways, perhaps with some conflicts in mind, like Frank Turner's, if you think of his book, this book, Receptions of Newman, was in a sense a way to kind of make good on the historical reception of Newman's philosophical and theological thought. So there was no uniform voice among the contributors, just as there was no uniform reception of Newman among those who interpreted his thought. In addition, there was no singular use of the term reception by the contributors. This project, as well as others over the years, has shaped my understanding of Newman's theological and philosophical thought and its relevance for contemporary issues. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of my ecumenical backdrop. I won't say in any explicit way, but when I think back on the projects that I worked on, it was interesting to see how those projects would get worked out with all the various traditions and perspectives and disciplines in mind. Now, concerning the recent elevation of Newman as a doctor of the church, I want to propose in this paper that one way to honor his legacy, or legacies, plural, involves examining critically and appreciatively Newman's thought, his life, and significance from explicitly ecumenical perspectives. So I want to do this in three ways. First, I want to spell out briefly what I mean by an ecumenical habit of mind and what that entails, especially in light of Newman's notion of a connected view that you find in the idea of a university. Second, I will provide some examples of Newman's own engagement with different philosophical perspectives in both his Anglican and Catholic periods of thought. Third, I will offer some concluding reflections on the relevance of a Newmanian approach to ecumenical relations. I use the word Newmanian because what I'm not claiming is that Newman, at least in this paper, historically, that Newman was an ecumenist. I'm thinking of Newman as a doctor of the church now in light of ecumenical relations. So to the historians in the room or on Zoom or whoever, if they get to watch this video as a lecture at some point, I want to say it's time for you to do the historical work. Some of that's being done, but I'm not making the historical claim today that Newman was and is an ecumenist. So I want to make a constructive link between the idea of a connected view and an ecumenical habit of mind. In focusing on the relevance of Newman's thought for ecumenical relations, as I've already said, I'm not making the historical claim that Newman was an ecumenist. There are plenty of works. If you want, email me and I'll be glad to share those with you on Newman and ecumenism. Instead, I will draw attention to a constructive link between the cultivation of an ecumenical habit of mind and Newman's concept of a connected view. Some may interpret the declaration of Newman as a doctor of the church as an appeal to sole ownership of John Henry Newman's legacy and fear that such a posture may block or hinder ecumenical dialogue. In other words, Newman started out as an Anglican, becomes Roman Catholic, and now he's been declared a doctor of the church, and so there's one place in which his legacy gets to be preserved. However, I think that such an appeal or worry would fail to honor an important aspect of Newman's legacy, namely his quest for truth and his recognition of the importance of interlocutors to help such a goal. Along these lines, two options seem to me to create roadblocks. On the one hand, the hagiographical option insulates Newman's thought from rigorous historical, theological, and philosophical scrutiny. On the other hand, the hypercritical posture oversimplifies or misses the subtlety of Newman's thought. From either angle, in my perspective, constructive appropriation is nearly impossible. In other words, Newman is this figure that is exempt from critical scholarship and examination, or we are going to examine Newman so critically that we almost miss the subtlety of his perspective or his thought. And I'm not saying in this paper that I'm going to be exempt from these roadblocks. I'm simply laying out these roadblocks that I see as a person who's worked on Newman for over the last 30 years. Occasionally, I have experienced the very thing I'm describing. The ongoing task, it seems to me then, is to work through the subtleties of Newman's thought, decipher possible connections, and engage in the very act of constructive work. In this sense, cultivating an ecumenical habit of mind lies not in making facile connections between the past and the present, but in seeking constructive possibilities in light of his overall thought and with the help of contemporary insights. Thus, the move to our own context today requires the capacity to broaden our horizons and to recognize salient insights. With this in mind, forming a connected view is crucial to discerning whether particular claims, insights, or pieces of information are worthy of consideration and implementation. Accordingly, a connected view for Newman entails grasping how various pieces of information fit together in light of one another and showing what this kind of understanding means for our current situation. In this sense, Newman's emphasis on forming a connected view is a complement to what I consider to be an ecumenical habit of mind. As he points out, we do not acquire a connected view at a, quote, single glance or gain possession of it at once. Instead, the evaluative process is cumulative and communal. It occurs by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction, the continual adaptation of many partial notions by the employment, concentration, and joint action of many faculties and exercises of mind. There are many other quotes in which he talks about the mind going at this process of acquiring the truth in a very slow and overall process, synchronically and diachronically. So sometimes we want to freeze frame Newman's thought and say, this is what Newman is saying. But I think if you take him seriously, his basic claim is something like this. Our ability to represent what we're thinking takes a lot of time. And development seems to be fundamental to that process. Well, could be. An intellectual position or posture of this kind, as Newman's describing it, compares, systematizes, and weaves ideas from different domains of inquiry and seeks to render a coherent understanding of those particular issues in those particular disciplines or areas of inquiry. Now, I know Newman gets viewed as not being interested in systematic thinking. I would strongly encourage you to read The Idea of a University, in which the philosophical habit of mind entails a systematic way of thinking. That's the whole idea with the philosophical habit of mind, is to see how things fit together in light of one another. Though the mind and the world for Newman are inextricably connected, the development of the former, that is the mind, requires the cultivation of the relevant intellectual virtues. For example, humility, honesty, love of knowledge, wisdom. Also safeguards against intellectual vices. For example, narrow-mindedness, intellectual dishonesty, dogmatism, and broadening one's intellectual horizons, namely what he calls the enlargement of the mind. The envisioned pursuit involves, for Newman, determining whether different commitments, perspectives, and disciplines enable one to form a connected view. If you read The Idea of a University, that's the way he starts out. The Idea of a University is the goal is to form a connected view or grasp of things. So if what I'm saying is in some sense plausible, then Newman thinks, and I think argues, that you need a host of interlocutors to enable you to move from a particular position to a more comprehensive view. That is, that those who see the value of acquiring a connected view show how their beliefs hang together in light of one another, and especially when they're in dialogue with their interlocutors. Let me give you an example of this, not only The Idea of a University, but the university sermons. Newman's account of wisdom in the university sermons furnishes the basic framework of his notion of a connected view in The Idea of a University. In his sermon on wisdom, Newman maps out the difference between what I would call, in modern day terms, narrow-mindedness and the pursuit of wisdom. Let me quote, "Narrow minds have no power of throwing themselves into the minds of others. They have stiffened in one position, as limbs of the body subjected to the confinement, or as are organs of speech, which after a while cannot learn new tones and inflections. They have already parceled out to their own satisfaction the whole world of knowledge. They have drawn their lines and formed their classes and given to each opinion, argument, principle, and party, its own locality. They possess to know where to find everything, and they cannot learn any other disposition. They are vexed at new principles of arrangement and grow giddy amidst cross divisions, and even if they make the effort, cannot master them. They think that any one truth excludes another which is distinct from it, and that every opinion is contrary to their own opinions, which is not included in them. None are so easily deceived by others as they who are preoccupied with their own notions. They are soon persuaded that another agrees with them if he disagrees with their opponents. They resolve his ideas into their own, and whatever words he may use to clear his meaning, even the most distinct and forcible, these fail to convey to them any new view or to open to them his mind. Now, I think Newman wants to contrast wisdom, which he, I think, believes is a form of mature reflection, one that is in some sense systematic, over against what I would call narrow-mindedness. So in this sense, a connected view, if what I'm saying is plausible, entails an orderly and mature development of thought, an integrative grasp of how various pieces of data fit together in light of one another, and the enlargement or expansion of mind. Rethinking the aims and scope of intellectual formation in this way, which I do believe is a neglected aspect of Newman's thinking, he's clearly, as Cyril rightly pointed out, he's clearly interested in getting at the truth. He's also equally interested in the formation of one who is seeking to get at the truth, both as a Christian and non-Christian. I'm going to illustrate this hopefully in this paper. Rethinking the aims and scope of intellectual formation in this way calls into question the kind of narrow-mindedness that takes a deep hold on those who try to make their, I love this quote, particular craft usurp and occupy the universe. Which is to say, you sort of see the universe from one perspective. And you could apply this to disciplines on campus occasionally. Somebody who thinks everything goes through science, or goes through literature, or goes through political science, or goes through rhetoric, or goes through religion, or goes through, you name it. Kind of fundamentalism, I think, that Newman is highlighting here. People shaped in this way deem their own mode of reflection as, quote, the center of all truth, and view every part or the chief parts of knowledge as if developed from it, determined by its principles, end of quote. They feel compelled to say something about every subject, habit, fashion. The public require it of them. And if so, they can only give sentence according to their own knowledge. Contracted pursuits of this sort, however, actually in Newman's mind, get in the way of gleaning greater levels of understanding of whatever subject we're describing or talking about. They turn out to be nothing more than obstacles to perceiving and assessing things beyond their particular commitments. Now, Newman argues at great length that the mind needs to be carefully trained in order to make the relevant connections, stave off the intellectual vices, and to pursue the relevant truth-conducive practices. As we've seen, narrowly minded or narrowly focused ways of proceeding fail both to connect domain-specific insights with other fields of knowledge and to recognize their own limitations and what we would call in modern terms intellectual humility. In contrast, this is again Newman's description, a person seeking a connected view strives to understand particular ways of inquiring in different domains of inquiry, while perhaps occasionally implementing insights into your ken of knowledge from a worldview and a perspective that you do not share. The process of forming a connected view then does not simply refer to the activity of properly functioning faculties like memory, sense perception, reason, and so on. In other words, you can have all of those intact and still not be very wise. More to the point, a connected view requires an active engagement of the mind in which people learn through disciplined and systematic reflection to make salient connections. They actively pursue and cultivate proper intellectual dispositions and habits in order to see how things fit together in light of one another, rather than passively receiving, quote, scraps and details. He describes students who occasionally gobble up thousands of pages of reading and are still pretty much saying what they've said prior to that reading. So in other words, they're just digesting, really not even digesting. They're just taking in isolated facts and they're not seeing their connections and relations. The enlargement of mind, he says, to contrast with that, consists in the comparison of the subjects of knowledge with one another. It is not the mere addition of our knowledge which is the enlargement, but the change of place, the moment or movement onwards of that moral center, to which what we know and what we have been acquiring, the whole mass of our knowledge, as it were, gravitates. And therefore, a philosophical cast of thought or a comprehensive mind or wisdom in conduct or policy implies a connected view of the old with the new, an insight into the bearing and influence of each part upon every other, without which there is no whole and could be no center. It is the knowledge not only of things, but of their mutual relations. It is organized and therefore living knowledge. As we've seen then, collecting bits of information is not sufficient for forming or cultivating a connected view. And I mentioned this, and I'll just quote this from Newman. For example, a great memory does not necessarily produce deeper understanding or levels of understanding, nor does memorizing grammatical rules necessarily result in proficient translation skills. I used to be a Greek tutor. I have witnessed this. Students can memorize the paradigms and not know how to translate if their life depends on it. Moreover, being well-read or well-versed in a particular area does not necessarily rule out the adoption of a narrow perspective. In fact, some people may quote, hear 1,000 lectures, quote, read 1,000 volumes, and yet understand things very much as they did before their inquiry began or started. The aim then of forming a connected view, to sort of summarize briefly, is not simply to acquire a lot of information. We were talking about this at lunch. But to see how things actually fit together in light of one another. The goal is, quote, the perfection of the intellect in which people learn to leaven the dense mass of facts and render a clear, calm, accurate vision and comprehension of all things. Now, I said I wasn't going to make the historical claim, and I'm not trying to do it in this section. I just want to make the point that Newman does in his own life interact with his interlocutors with whom he agrees and disagrees. And I'm going to pick all Anglicans today, just to illustrate the point, philosophically, on what Newman does with these writers. And there's certainly going to be disagreement on my interpretation, I'm sure. I'll just say that in advance. Some think Newman is this anti-Lockean. I'm not convinced he is a complete anti-Lockean. Let me illustrate. As I previously stated, I'm not making the historical claim that Newman was an ecumenist. However, I think we can look to some examples in Newman's thought with his Anglican interlocutors to make the point that there seems to be this emphasis on the connection between an ecumenical habit of mind, retrospectively, constructively speaking, and this notion of a connected view. I'm not going to identify Newman with any one school of thought today. I've got it on the record that on rationality of religious belief, he's informed by Aristotle, he's informed by Hume, he's informed by Thomas Reid, he's informed by definitely John Locke, definitely by many people. So my point is not to sort of say Newman is a fill in the blank epistemologist. We've been trying to make that case on the common sense tradition, and I think we've got some plausible arguments, but I think Newman is very much ad hoc when it comes to these kinds of things. As I hope to show here, Newman's account of faith and reason wonderfully illustrates the intersection of his Anglican and Catholic periods of thought. John Locke, for one, is an instructive example. Newman engages critically and appreciatively with Locke's thought, especially with respect to his account of the rationality of religious belief. However, as Basil Mitchell points out, or has pointed out, Locke's careful and sympathetic attempt to delineate the spheres of reason and revelation while leaving the final judgment with reason was felt by Newman to be profoundly unsatisfactory, albeit never to be dismissed out of hand. The last part is what I want to emphasize. You can critique an author while benefiting from an author. In fact, my argument is complex assent in the grammar is a way to make the Lockeans happy, which is to say the gullibility that comes with simple assent gets caught at the door. And what Newman's asking for with complex assent is a retrospective evaluation of the grounds for why Christian belief is rational. So Newman's engagement with Locke is also appreciative. He deeply admires Locke's commitment to the pursuit of truth, as he says in the grammar. In particular, he agrees with many of Locke's, quote, remarks upon reasoning and proof, end of quote, and with his critical evaluation of enthusiasm. If you read Locke's treatment of enthusiasm and you read Newman, it seems very clear that Newman is channeling Lockean, the Lockean worry about enthusiasm. In addition, if you read Locke's Of the Conduct of Understanding, his idea of a comprehensive mind sounds very, or I put it the other way, Newman's idea of a philosophical habit of mind sounds very comparable and very compatible with Locke's view of a comprehensive view. So that's just Locke. So I would say construct, critical, and appreciative. Another one would be Butler. Newman was not uncritical with respect to Butler, but certainly as he's editing and putting together the later editions of the university sermons, he does not go out of his way to say, I now reject Butler because he was an Anglican. He actually appropriates them in the university sermons and in the grammar of assent, especially on the probability as a way of life. Newman explains the importance of Butler for developing his own account of the rationality of religious belief, in particularly 2 or 3 works. An important epistemic feature and an epistemic feature with which the grammar is connected or concerned is the role of the illative sense and the role that it plays in the final resolution of concrete questions. Here, the illative sense determines the limit of converging probabilities and the reasons sufficient for a proof. So there is, again, another illustration in which I think Newman is engaging both as an Anglican and as a Catholic in a particular Anglican writer, in this case, Butler. The last example would be Whately. Notwithstanding their differences, Newman also acknowledges and appreciates the extent to which his mentor, Richard Whately, shaped his own intellectual formation and his constructive account of faith and reason. As Newman notes, Whately, quote, emphatically opened my mind and taught me to think and use my reason. He had taught me to see with my own eyes and to walk with my own feet. He had not only taught me to think, but to think for myself. One other point that I think gets missed in university sermons is that, yes, Newman is critiquing Whately and the crowd, the noetics. He's certainly doing that. But as Gertchen says in one of his recent articles, Whately's influence is no more apparent than in Newman's distinction between implicit and explicit reason. In this respect, Newman's crucial distinctions between how the mind actually works and how we try to represent such activity in and through logical analysis. The former is logically prior to, quote, investigation, argument, or proof, end of quote. The latter is, quote, but the explicit form which the reasoning takes in the case of particular minds. As I said, as Gertchen points out in one of his articles, I'm just going to quote him, Whately's conception of logic as a formal science that analyzes arguments rather than a set of rules to dictate the reasoning process provided Newman with the necessary framework to distinguish logic or formal argument from reasoning as such. Thus, Newman offers a thorough and indeed systematic reinterpretation of evidential apologetics by creatively expanding the theoretical framework he inherited from Whately's works on logic and rhetoric. So there are 3 examples, seems to me, to illustrate the point that Newman, again, while I'm not saying he's engaged in ecumenical dialogue, certainly sees the value in engaging his interlocutors both critically and appreciatively. How are we doing on time? Good. Implications. I've drawn attention to Newman's concept of a connected view to clarify what it might mean, not what it means, but what it might mean to cultivate an ecumenical habit of mind in our current context. It seems plausible to suggest, at least at this point, that the concept of a connected view can be extended to shape ecumenical relations, specifically in how we might approach, evaluate, develop, extend, recommend Newman's thought, or how we might engage with others in light of Newman's own thought. We should explore how various aspects of his thought fit together in light of one another. So we look at Newman's own works, not only one work, but we look at all of his works, and we try to see how that all fits together, as much as, and depending on the question we're asking. But also, and this is where we might be stretched, let's see in what way Newman's thought can actually be extended beyond Newman's thought to thought currently in our philosophical, theological context. That's what we were trying to do in the Routledge book. We were trying to look at how philosophers are going to be engaging Newman's thought. The point of this essay is not to suggest then that Newman's conversion to Rome was without its challenges and critical reactions. I'm aware of my Anglican friends. They've written on that, Jeremy Morris and Ben King and many others. So I don't want to bypass that and say there aren't going to be some wounds that we need to address as Christians from different perspectives and denominations and traditions. So I'm certainly not, I'm not trying to bypass that. I'm just saying that requires a really careful set of considerations by various disciplines. Rather, what I'm simply suggesting is that a Newmanian approach to ecumenical relations, constructively conceived, calls for the capacity to connect new and existing insights and to enlarge our intellectual horizons. In this sense, engaging Newman or Newman's thought needs to be done, as I've said, appreciatively, critically, and holistically. We should be clear about what we're trying to accomplish and evaluate accordingly. More importantly, the practice of gleaning insights from others plays a fundamental role in achieving what Newman stipulated as the aim of a connected view, namely seeing how things fit together in light of one another and thus acquiring a view of the whole. As we've seen, a deep immersion in a set of practices is fundamental to the formation of what I'm describing as an ecumenical habit of mind. This habit of mind requires a stable disposition, disciplined reflection, the willingness to defer and learn from others, and the ability to render apt judgments regarding ecumenical dialogue. I want to close with some suggestions, especially as we seek to think of how to connect an ecumenical habit of mind and a connected view. First, these are purely my suggestions for further reflection. Forming an ecumenical habit of mind includes disposition as well as ability. Let me explain what I mean by that. In other words, it is conceivable that a person very well disposed to read many works on Newman and ecumenism may not be very insightful in ecumenical dialogue, in grasping what are salient points. I've been in enough of those discussions to see sometimes in the room, reading the room is important. Knowing how and when and where to say what you're about to say. The ideal is for both disposition, that is the willingness to have ecumenical dialogue, and the ability, that is the capacity to actually succeed in doing that, are formed in the ecumenical habit of mind. Second, people and communities that claim to be interested in acquiring an ecumenical habit of mind need to promote, not obstruct, the pursuit of this goal. To really open up possibilities for this to happen, we must make every effort to avoid undermining others in the name of what we think is true. In so doing, when we do obstruct the way, we may be missing out on the wisdom that is right in front of us. We know what it's like when people are unwilling to open up their own views to critical reflection and when they refuse to glean insights from others. Insulating our claims from public scrutiny cuts against the grain of what I would describe as a connected view. Third, we need to think of the cultivation of an ecumenical habit of mind more in social than individualistic terms. Such a pursuit rarely, if ever, takes place in isolation. Rather, the process is profoundly social. The practice of gleaning insights from others plays a fundamental role, as I've said, in how we go about doing this. And we need paragons and guides to help us do this. I'm thankful he's passed. Billy Abraham was one of the most ecumenical people I've ever met. And people have confused ecumenical with being the kind of person that would rigorously engage you in dialogue. And as our friend Cyril has probably experienced, open dialogue. And you knew with Billy you were safe to object and to respond in ways that I found to be very formative. I want to say this too. I've been reading about receptive ecumenism, and I think this is a place where we need to get clear on the kinds of virtues that we're talking about: theological virtues, spiritual virtues, and intellectual virtues. Lastly, I want to say I think it's high time to carve out a fuller narrative in light of Newman being declared a doctor of the church that places Newman's thought in the modern story of ecumenism. I mean, I think people are doing this, but I think to do it more deliberately, to say, what's the story look like? This sort of project would need to do historical, yes, by historian friends, theological and philosophical justice to Newman's own works. Perhaps this is the place in which historians, theologians, and philosophers learn to collaborate, rather than seeing what they're doing as the bee's knees, the only way to do this, but actually to see the importance of these disciplines in conversation. So I want to end by this last paragraph saying the following: cultivating an ecumenical habit of mind, in my estimation, refuses to insulate thick commitments, that is, your particular commitments, from broader conversations, nor does it strip people of their particular habits, practices, and beliefs under the guise of thinly conceived forms of public discourse. In other words, when I'm having dialogue with Catholics, I want you to be Catholic. And I want you to acknowledge I'm Protestant. In addition, providing a more adequate understanding of the tensile relationship between particular sets of claims, the pink elephant in the room, authority, and a more comprehensive view is crucial to the pursuit of an ecumenical habit of mind. It is my hope that this proposal, very early in the stage proposal, will provoke further reflection and development towards this particular end. Thank you.
You noted several times that Newman was not an ecumenist per se, at least in terms of our understanding of the term as like a profession or a vocation today. And I think you've done a good job demonstrating the potential value of Newman's connected view for efforts that are aimed at Christian unity, which we should highlight as a demand of the gospel. Okay. In conversations about this topic, I have tried to further distinguish some of Newman's hard sayings for ecumenism, so to speak, particularly those uttered in the midst of controversies. I was thinking of Gladstone, Vatican I, papal infallibility. So there are a number of hard sayings that Newman utters with respect to the ecumenical project. Yeah. So with this framing, can you speak a bit more on Newman being a valuable voice for ecumenism today, despite his not being a formal ecumenist, and even the ability to proof text him as being an anti-ecumenist?
So I'm thinking of my friend Logan Gage. We've been working on a book, one of the Cambridge Element books on Newman and epistemology. And there are those days where Newman will say some things, you're just thinking, how do I square that with what he says over here? And I give you the particulars if you want, like his stuff on Locke or his stuff on degrees of assent, and then he says degrees of assent in the Apologia. So there are times where I think because he is not systematic in the following way, he is writing within, as he says, a particular call and context. And he is probably in philosophical terms a particularist. He starts with these particular claims, and he's not always, if I can say this with all due respect, he's not always consistent. So I would want to come clean and say there are those sayings about what he says about Protestantism, but like my friend Cyril, I'm going to cite my friend Cyril, he also made mistakes as an Anglican, right? About the Catholic Church. And so we have to go back and look at those sayings and say, is that what he thinks about the Catholic Church now? And of course, you can always say retrospectively, he's come to the end, but that's an easy thing to say. So what I would prefer to say is something like this. Let's do inference to the best explanation. Let's look at what Newman says. Let's not avoid the hard sayings. Then let's see how that fits with these other things we're describing and see where it goes. So I don't want to rescue him at this point, and I don't want to sort of eclipse some of these challenging moments that he not only makes theologically but philosophically, and it to the point of people scratching their heads wondering how the like. If I were his friend, I would have said, you don't have to write the section on the indefectibility of certitude. It's more confusing than helpful. If I can be pretty straightforward, well, I have be straightforward about that. And there are times where I think he's so adamantly responding to something in the moment, but I wonder if he gets caught up in the moment as a historical moment and figure. And now it's our job to say, 2 centuries later, what would Newman think if he were around in light of the last that period of time with Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox writers? And I will say, just doing that with people, writing with people, I've learned a lot. It's also made it very complicated because I understand the fracture, I understand the ecumenical divide. But I also think we've done some wonderful projects together that I think has moved us in a direction that's better than it was. If that's helpful.
That is helpful. And I think, as you mentioned in the paper, this could be a moment for collaboration where, certainly historians and others who are knowledgeable about Newman's life and the theological controversies can also speak to why he might have responded in such a way that seems really harsh. But at the same time, he's speaking to family members who are Anglican and others in a very different way than he was speaking to Gladstone. Right. So I think that I agree with you. Okay. This is more of a comment, but it goes to kind of the heart of I think, this project. And you've reflected a lot on this connected view. So you pull from the Oxford University sermons and Newman's idea, which are both great, but I also would want to point to some of his historical works early on, because the project at that point was to create a connected history, one that would connect the history of the church to the believers in that time. So he uses that word quite a bit early on. And then one that is in a more doctrinal context, his 1868 letter to Flanagan from the Papers on Infallibility. There he talks about the importance of a connected view for the deposit of faith. Now there it's like kind of the church can access in terms of the fullness of the deposit, but it kind of goes to your point. He actually has quite an interesting statement talking about a connected view and living the philosophy that is Christianity. So I think that goes to your point as well, and also has some harsh language for those who are narrow-minded. So that's more of a comment. I don't know if you want to.
Again, mainly philosophically speaking, I thought his concept of wisdom and the connected view and the development of doctrine, he even says some things that that are really helpful. But I would love to see historic. Let me say to my historian friends, we want to make sure we're getting Newman right. I get it. We want to make sure that we're back in the context, we're historicizing. I get it. But we also want to see how all of that stuff gets unpacked and connected and developed. And so a strong encouragement for my historian and theologian friends, let's work together on seeing where this goes, because I think there's some value. And I wouldn't have said this probably a year ago. I wouldn't have said, thinking about this, but after the declaration, I start saying, I think there is an ecumenical aspect to what he's doing here.
Great. So when it comes to avoiding a narrowness of mind and practicing intellectual virtues, one is seemingly able to discern any goodness or elements of truth in other systems by practicing such virtues. So would it be fair to associate an ecumenical habit of mind with projects like receptive ecumenism that involve discerning the gifts of other denominations and how they might enrich one's own?
I've been reading that literature, and I think there is. I would say welcome the analytic crowd to that discussion also, not just the pragmatists. There are analytic philosophers that I think would be, and theologians would be interested in something like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. And then a couple of other points. So this ecumenical habit of mind, I think, is crucial because it's connected to another crucial element for Newman's value for ecumenism, which is his dynamic view of tradition, right? And not being shy when it comes to truth, wherever it's discovered, within Christianity or in other systems. But I also think it's important, and I was wondering what you think here, about things like Newman as a Catholic deciding to republish nearly everything he wrote as an Anglican, right? And how this facilitated a cross-pollination, so to speak, between traditions, and involving the various intellectual influences that both you and Cyril have kind of raised today in terms of Newman's background, religious, philosophical, and so forth. Just wondering if you could talk maybe.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Logan, I mentioned you a few times today, but we were, as we're preparing for this book, we said, does Newman have an idea of divine faith? Because there are some that want to say it's really prominent in Newman's thought. And I couldn't find a lot of it in the grammar. I found one reference on the Trinity, and I found divine faith, and then there's the Thesis de Fide that Newman published. And I really think this is an example where Newman's Anglicanism isn't being dissipated. That as he's editing some of these works, he's not going out of his way to say, by the way, I changed my mind. Let me throw in this kind of scholastic notion of divine faith in a central way. It's there. He has actually have a quote in one of his letters where he says, I adhere to divine faith, but I wanted to show the historical and natural aspects of faith, which I think is what he's doing with Froude and Whately and these guys. He's trying to say there's no special pleading. I'm appealing to the empirical. I'm appealing. And so in that sense, I think he's seeing the Anglican and Catholic commitments as being compatible. Not always, but in that particular example, I think with Butler, as I mentioned, even with Whately, as tough as that was, he had his falling out with Whately. He did not forget the lessons he learned from Whately and how to reason as a member of the Noetics.
Thank you. So I wonder if we could, Elizabeth, would you mind? Are there any questions from the crowd?
I saw Logan's hand first.
Thanks, Fred. Just a quick question. I just want to hear your thoughts on development of doctrine as a possible area of collaboration, of dialogue between Protestants and Catholics. It seems like everyone needs a notion of development of some kind. Has that already been worked over heavily by on the Protestant side? And is there room for dialogue and agreement there? Or what challenges do you see? Is it just insurmountable?
My friend Cyril can say more about this, I'm sure. But I'll say this, there are Protestants who've thought about the development of doctrine. In my tradition, which is the Free Church, Church of Christ tradition, we've gone to schools in which we've learned about the great tradition. We've people who are working on patristic writers, but we've never made that connection. And I think this is a time and place for us to think more explicitly about the relationship between divine revelation, inspiration, the development of doctrine. And I think Newman's a great place to look at it. There are also some evangelicals who've been doing this. But yeah, I think this needs to be done with greater fervor.
Hi, Dr. Aquino. My name is Alex. I'm a doctoral student here working on Newman, here at Duquesne, working on Newman. I find this very interesting and fruitful. I think my thoughts are drawn to the negative aspects of knowing and of epistemology, suffering, self-denial, recognizing one's own failures. And I even think in Dr. Cimarelli's comments, he talked about almost rejecting a narrow view in order to work towards a connected view. It seems like Newman, because towards the end of his sermon on wisdom, he says that the one thing that I want you to remember is that both narrowness and wholeness, a connected view, exist in the same person. And so it seems as though Newman is hinting at this fact that the undoing of a narrow mind is acknowledging one's own ignorance, one's own bigotry, right? And once we can acknowledge the areas that we're bigoted, that we can then begin to move towards an integrated view. And I'm thinking like that's on the individual level. I can think of in the Catholic Church, for example, Vatican II demonstrated a good movement towards acknowledging perhaps failures in the church's history. So, there's kind of an analogy you can even think about there. But I was wondering if maybe you could say more on any of these negative aspects of how we come to know and like, I mean, what might be ecumenically significant about something like that?
Yeah, well, I'm spot on. But I think Newman acknowledges you can have a connected view with respect to one discipline and not with respect to the connections of disciplines. And I think having a sense or a list of these qualities, I call them virtues, would be really important. And what I like about Newman is, and I think Cyril brought this out in his paper, he's deeply in the secular world while critiquing it, but also not ignoring its value. I'm the one that wrote the piece on British naturalism. I think Newman fits into that tradition. And some would say, he can't. He's a sacramentalist. Well, epistemically, he's saying there's something natural going on here I want to highlight, while recognizing the supernatural being mediated, as he says, the universe is sacramental, back to Origen and Clement of Alexandria. So I think what he's highlighting is he's also very apocalyptic at times. I mean, he is certainly not naive, certainly troubled by what's going on in his historical context. So I think having that awareness of what you describe as the prophetic maybe is important, while the constructive. So I don't want it to be either. I want it to be both that. There are going to be some virtues that are going to push us to be more open to what's actually happening in the world, while recognizing the limits of what the world can give us. So I think Newman, now he's not perfect, because 33 volumes of letters, where he sometimes be a curmudgeon, right? He sometimes maybe be a little too involved, if I can say that respectfully. So I think he would acknowledge he's not exempt from the very thing you're describing. Saint Doctor, I think, Cyril, you did a wonderful job of highlighting the importance of recognizing the limits when we attribute things to these particular writers. I don't know if that's helpful.
It's
There's so much I could say, but you know, but some of it sort of is just the standard. So there's no internal kind of quarrels over little or nothing. So I leave those aside. I think so. I want to talk again to the question, sort of, you know, which comes up sort of, you know, in that particular sermon on wisdom, and try to think through sort of, you know, what Newman is going to allow in terms of particularity or stance, or just simple view of the world, and what sort of, you know, he's essentially dissenting from. It seems to me sort of with the idea sort of, you know, of the grandmother who doesn't know too much, is probably too busy to know any further, but she minds her own business. In other words, it's a kind of law, you could say law of humility, and you could if you might, but it would be also just simply this kind of natural response that of non-entitlement to judge other things, which one is not invested entirely in. So I think we have to contrast that, right? Sort of, you know, which is a kind of restrictedness from what I think he's talking about in terms of restrictedness. When he's talking about narrowness of mind, he's talking about a narrowness of mind as that mind is actually operative, and that mind is self-assertive. And the point that he tends to make, so there's no, and this I think is a very interesting point. He wants to say that the narrow mind, which is going to operate his mind in the way the grandmother is not operating his mind, is going sort of to take sort of, you know, on slender evidence. That is, not in fact having gone through all the motions that later on Southern Idea University is going to tell us is going to bring you to an educated mind. But without doing that, is on the reflective level, not just simply sort of on the unreflective level, on the reflective level, going to make a claim. And therefore, it seems to me that sermon is about entitlements. I mean, which again, sort of is some of the Lockean tradition is about entitlement, so it's a repetition of that in a certain way. But he wants to say that if you're going, there are responsibilities that come with making a claim. A fundamentalist, shall we say, a fundamentalist take on religion is not, shall we say, a regression back to the grandmother. It depends not on having too little rationality. It depends upon the presumption of having it all. And I think for our current day, that distinction is required. we can slip slide sort of from someone sort of be narrow-minded because they're undereducated or not educated, and therefore they don't listen to us, but they don't listen to anyone else either, for that matter, from someone sort of who is either educated, but probably sort of is undereducated actually, making a claim, which is a claim sort of of totality. That is, things are this and they are no other. So I think we actually need that distinction, which is implicit in that sermon, in order for that sermon to help us. Because we can hear it, we might hear it as, the answer to all the problems is, maybe we'll have a bachelor's that goes 6 years, right? Or we'll have a supplemental bachelor's sort of in addition to the one sort of which might be kind of more specific. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that it is a habit of mind, which is either can be curricularized or not curricularized. But if you move to the level of reflection and the level of making a claim, responsibilities you did not have on the first level are responsibilities you now have. And you've got to be true to those responsibilities. But also, those claims that, shall we say, these overclaims are claims that could not happen unless reason intervened. That, I think, is crucial.
I agree with your thought. I didn't have time to unpack this, but as he starts out the sermon, he basically says there are comparable examples of Christians and non-Christians who would be under the category of bigotry. And there is a deliberate aspect. And he certainly acknowledges the importance. How would I put this? Not everyone in the church has to do the same thing equally well. So there's what I would call an epistemic deference to, as he says in the grammar, the bell of the intellect. That there are some that are going to be up to snuff to defend the faith, and others. But he is careful, like the simple assent. The person who goes to church and just adheres to the faith and has really bad reasons for it. Newman's he is slightly, how would I put it, elevated in his evaluation of the elite and the not so elite. So I agree with you. I didn't have time to bring that up, but today I want to just highlight the importance of the intellectuals on this. By the intellectuals, I mean people who are really committed explicitly to ecumenical dialogue. That's helpful. Thanks.
Do we have any further questions from the gallery?
I would just, you talked about a set of practices, immersion in a set of practices. And I was just wondering about, whether it's the philosophical habit of mind or its manifestation with an ecumenical habit of mind. Newman talks a lot about in the grammar of like exertion and the work. And so what would it take for this to actually be something that can benefit the church and Christianity, widely?
I have benefited from my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters on the tradition. When I wrote an essay years ago on John Cassian, and I've done some work on spiritual formation, and I think the resources are there. I think the problem is we think that's spiritual stuff that's not relevant to getting at the truth, right? We need to go the intellectual route. I think what we need are practices within the Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant traditions, regulate what I call regulated virtues that are going to regulate our inquiry, liturgically, theologically, intellectually. And so, with your question, observation, and I'm convinced of this. I'm going forward with this because there were times where I thought, I don't know, maybe I'm onto some hunch. I wish Newman didn't use 5 words to describe the same thing: wisdom, the philosophical habit of mind, connected view. So I probably would want to say, number one, let's get clear on a term rather than terms. And let's get clear on the resources and virtues that are going to help us do this. And how does that work within your actual liturgical structure, and not divorce that from ecumenism, if that makes any sense.
Hi, Fred. I'm Kyle Bennett. We know each other. Good to see you. Thank you for that. I'm curious. For a moment there, when you talk about habits of mind, I'm reminded of, I don't know exactly how Aristotle puts it, but the mark of an educated person is that they can entertain an idea and not believe it. And as I've done work in ecumenism as well, and I haven't thought very much about habits of mind. in doing that work and practicing ecumenism. But one concept, which I think is explicitly a Christian concept, one concept that comes to mind that I find fascinating to think about, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are, is the concept of hospitality. To what extent, and I think etymologically, hosting, hostiles, hospital, to what extent is hospitality a intellectual virtue? To what extent can that orient our understanding of an ecumenical habit of mind? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually have a list of virtues that I have in my syllabus to students to illustrate the importance, because they say they're interested in spirituality. They want to, I say, all right, how about learning to listen to someone with whom you disagree, to really listen to what they're saying. So if that's what you mean by hospitality, then sign me up. I tend to use a different word: open-mindedness, tenacity, being able to sort of stick with your perspective while opening the door to the possibility you could be wrong. So I think it seems to me that's what we need in our society big time, not only in the church, is the ability to really take seriously charitable, intellectual charity. I'm going to give the most plausible view of the position that I reject. And I'm going to do, now you could do that as a motivation of Christian love, right? Loving your enemy. What does it mean to love someone intellectually? Love knowledge, have a love for knowledge, that tenacity, open-mindedness. So I take all of that to be a framework in which we might use the word hospitality. The worry I have is sometimes hospitality means I'm not going to push back. I'm going to be hospitable. And my point is that's not being hospitable. That's being dishonest. At some point, you should be able to say to someone, I hear what you're saying. I think this is why you're saying it. At least this is the philosophical habit that I see occasionally. I could be wrong. Here's what I hear you saying. If we can find ways to do that in our current culture, we're in a good role.
I want to offer a mediation between the concept of hospitality and intellectual openness. I mean, the first is a reminder. One of the marks of Christianity in the early period was precisely this. In other words, it's built into the DNA of Christianity, that hospitality, which of course is performative, it's not intellectual, is sort of part and parcel of its native grammar. Then, of course, if that's the case, hospitality is on now talking on the reflective level. I wanted to make sure that we talk at there are different levels. Then, sort of, it seems to me, that's prior. That performance, I think we need to remember, performance in Christianity is prior to thinking. Then it would seem to me then that it makes sense, it rhymes, that this hospitality, which is performative, is enacted at the level of reflection, which of course in the early church is precisely what happened, right? So it does look as if sort of at, let's say, our current moment, the two things are demanded concurrently. One sort of is hospitality to those who disagree with us, hospitality to Islam, which also was founded paradoxically on hospitality, despite sort of how we have constructed it. So here we have, so in addition to, I suppose, ecumenical is ecumenical, shall we say, plus, that is to other religions entirely. How do we negotiate with these religions? And even how do we discern the conditions of the possibility of negotiation? So I would like to argue in another place. We got to condition that the possibility to negotiate with, so to have dialogue with Islam, since whatever the particular form of Islam at the moment, and however agitated that particular form is, where, of course, the West has conspired with respect to the creation of that particular agitation. Fact is, Islam is founded on hospitality. So wouldn't it be good that one religion founded upon hospitality can sort of function in an open-minded way with respect to another religion which is founded on hospitality?
Here, sign me up. One pushback I might I don't know if I would make the performative intellectual distinction you're making per se, because I think entailed in the performance is some sort of intellectual set of commitments. And the cognitive capacities that Newman talks about, the illative sense, which is the beginning, middle, and end. He doesn't say prior. He says beginning, middle, and end of all inquiry is the illative sense. So from a Newmanian point of view, I'm going to say performative is not distinguishable, at least in that sense, as prior to. It seems to me that how we're engaging in dialogue with, because I absolutely would wholeheartedly say we need to see greater examples of what you're describing. And I just assume as a Christian, there's some fundamental basic agreements that most human beings would prefer to be heard than not. Most human beings would prefer, well, sometimes deviations from that, but most people deep down inside would like to be truth tellers. But we know that things get in the way of that, right? The will and background beliefs and all that kind of stuff. So sign me up to that. I would just say we need, as Christians, to think about this in light of our tradition, but also with the upgrade in the materials that we've learned from the intellectual virtue traditions.